Good afternoon, and on behalf of Hudson Institute, I would like to welcome all of those who have joined us in person and online today for bipartisan cooperation on US Indo-Pacific policy under the new Trump administration. This event is part of the Motwani Jadeja US-India Dialogue series. I'm Aparna Pandey, Director of the Initiative on the Future of India in South Asia. Founded in 1961 by strategist Herman Kahn, Hudson challenges conventional thinking and seeks to guide policymakers and global leaders in government and business through a vigorous program of publications, conferences, briefings, and recommendations. Over the last 3 presidential administrations, the Indo-Pacific has emerged a key area of focus. The Japanese and Indian prime ministers were among the first few foreign leaders to meet with President Trump. And Secretary of State Marco Rubio's first major diplomatic engagement was a foreign minister summit with his Quad, namely Japanese, Indian, and Australian counterparts. However, much like Washington's longtime allies in Europe, America's partners in the Indo-Pacific are concerned about the future of the alliance network. To discuss the Indo-Pacific, we have with us today Congressman Ami Bera. Congressman Bera is a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, a ranking member of the Subcommittee on East Asia and the Pacific. He's also a member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and Select Committee on Coronavirus Pandemic. Congressman Bera will offer some opening remarks for 5 minutes or so, and that will be followed by a moderated conversation before we turn to the audience for questions. Congressman Bera, over to you.
Great, thank you. And I'll try to keep my comments short because the best part of this is the dialogue between the two of us, but then also answering the questions from the audience. I agree with you that I think the progress on the U.S.-India relationship, regardless of who's in the White House, has always been on the upward trajectory, certainly for the last 2 decades, if not longer. I'll couch my remarks thinking about President Trump's first term and then how that leads into the second term. It did seem like he and Prime Minister Modi had a very strong positive relationship in the first term. I think India was very strategic and very early on. Prime Minister Modi coming and visiting President Trump, anticipating where President Trump might be on some of the tariff issues, and certainly trying to get ahead of some of those issues. You touched on the fact that the ministerial Quad dialogue happened on day 2, I think, of the Trump administration. So again, suggests the importance of that relationship. I was just recently in Australia, and again, I think the Aussies recognize the importance of the relationship with India and the Indo-Pacific. And I know we'll talk more broadly than just the U.S.-India relationship, certainly. I think that the Quad foundationally is, from a strategic geopolitical maritime security perspective, is really important. One area that also we've been talking a lot about in Congress in a nonpartisan way and raising is the Indian Ocean region, right? So we were probably a little late to pay attention to the Pacific Islands and what was happening in that maritime space. Certainly felt like President Obama took the South China Sea too lightly. We can't make the same mistake in the Indian Ocean region when we see some of our potential competitors or adversaries with China setting up ports in Pakistan, in the Emirates, in Africa. Again, that's something we've talked about with Australians and certainly have talked about with the Indians and our European allies as well. So, on U.S.-India, I think the trajectory's in a big direction. I'm headed off to Korea soon, and I think those are going to be really interesting conversations, as we see 25% auto tariffs and steel tariffs and kind of the uncertainty of what that looks like. And I certainly, when I next go to India, I think those conversations will come up. So I'll stop with that and let's have a conversation.
Sure. Thank you. We are still in the early months of this presidential administration. And by and large, the focus has remained the West and the Middle East, not really the Indo-Pacific, broadly speaking. The economic, military, and the tech challenges that the US and its partners face from China, however, remains unabated. How would you, you mentioned you're going to Korea, but how would you reassure American allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific that there is sustained American interest and support, and that the Indo-Pacific policy will continue over the next months, if not years?
So let me start with the Biden administration and some of the foundational work I think they did throughout the administration. Reestablishing, if I went back 5 years and thought about the Japan-Korea relationship, was in a very bad place. It's in a much stronger place right now, and reestablishing the trilateral partnership, through intentional diplomacy, but also through dialogues like the Camp David dialogue. So, Korea has its politics. Japan has a new administration coming in, but I think Prime Minister Kishida was very intentional in terms of visiting early. And we'll see what happens with Korean elections coming up. But so, I think the Trump administration understands, let's keep that trilateral strongly engaged. The Philippines are coming back into our fold. I think Secretary of Defense is there today. I think that's very intentional as well. How do we keep that moving in the right direction in that relationship? There was recently at Indo-PACOM, clearly a focus on, avoiding conflict, but strategically having deterrence with China, making sure China doesn't make a mistake. And then, we already touched on, on day 2, having the ministerial level Quad dialogue, and I suspect there'll be a leaders level dialogue soon as well. So I think all of those suggest the Trump administration's focused on the Indo-Pacific. I also think, as we interpret the administration's goals to bring the conflict in Ukraine to an end, that potentially frees up assets. And when they talk about European security and Europe really taking primary responsibility for European security, I interpret that as saying, okay, we've been trying to pivot to the Indo-Pacific. We've got to be able to do that. And that goes back to the President Obama wanting to pivot in the Middle East, kind of pulling us back in, Ukraine pulling us back in this direction. I think President Trump actually means Europe, if we interpret signal dialogue and so forth, I think that was a little joke there, but I think they mean Europe, you've got to take primary responsibility for European security, which then allows you to start moving assets to what probably is the primary field of competition in the 21st century.
Thank you. Normally, when there's a discussion of the Indo-Pacific, the focus is on the Pacific end. And I'll come to Pacific in a little while, but normally not the Indian Ocean. In 2024, you co-sponsored legislation that was focused on strengthening the role of the US in the Indian Ocean. Could I ask you, why do you view the Indian Ocean as being critical to American interests? And what are the opportunities for the US to work with like-minded countries there?
Yeah, so again, as I mentioned in my open, we were late to pay attention to what was happening in the Pacific Ocean, around the Pacific Islands. We see what's happening in the Indian Ocean region, and as we've talked to the Indians, and this is an ocean that has your name on it, so we have to be in partnership here with the British. That we need to be in partnership here because huge maritime security issues there, freedom of navigation issues, and so I think that's why we're paying close attention to this. And again, I think that's where the Quad can come in a bit. And the other big partnership foundationally was AUKUS, right? So AUKUS is more than just an economic partnership. It's about maintaining naval superiority as a deterrent, but also it brings Australia closer to us, and Australia then does have a role in the Indian Ocean region as well.
Thank you. If we turn to the other end of the Indo-Pacific, we've all seen how China has sought to use carrots and sticks to deepen the presence in the Pacific Islands. And again, over the last few years, you have co-sponsored legislations on the importance of these islands. What would you advise the administration about the policy to adopt towards this region in the months ahead?
I'd say let's restore USAID and some of the programs and development tools that we've had whether it's USAID or in other functions, we need those development tools. They don't have to be what we had previously necessarily, but how can, part of my goal when I was in Australia is, there might be 3 or 6 months where we're going to need Australia, Japan, New Zealand to step up a little bit so we don't lose too much ground, but we'll be back. I mean, I think, Secretary Rubio certainly understands the importance of the Pacific Islands, served on foreign affairs and intelligence with Mike Waltz. I think he understands the strategic importance there. So I think there are folks close, but again, the next 3 to 6 months, we're sending the wrong signals there. But we have to come back, and maybe it is coming back in a different way where we're sharing resources and partnering with Japan, which is showing an increased interest in the Pacific Islands. And obviously Australia and New Zealand have been there, perhaps even the French who have interest in the British. So what does that look like? And then the Koreans also have shown some interest in the islands. I do worry, some of the disadvantages that we, having traveled to multiple of the islands last year, the people are still with us, but when it comes time to forming government, the PRC, Beijing, uses slightly different tactics. We can't hand bags of cash out to, elected officials. They can. So, and that is a problem. We've got to figure out how to combat that.
Thank you. Congressman, you are the co-chair of the Quad Congressional Caucus, established last September. This mini-lateral has grown in both the number of summits it hosts, the areas it works in. How do you see the evolution in the next few months? I mean, are the areas you see as more likely to find support with this administration? And I'd like to throw in, add in Southeast Asia and say, how do you see the Quad and ASEAN working in the days ahead?
I'm also co-chair of the ASEAN caucus. I guess I'm
Great.
co-chair of a lot of caucuses. But that, I think from an economic perspective, certainly let's put tariffs aside because that's making everyone a little bit nervous. But from an economic perspective, I think we can deepen relationships. From a supply chain redundancy perspective, certainly there's concern about choke points where China, as for APIs in the pharmaceutical industry, can we move some of that to India? Can we move some of that strategically in terms of critical minerals and so forth to the ASEAN countries? Those are conversations that started in the Biden administration, but continue with the Trump administration. Can we use tools like the Mineral Security Partnership with the Japan and Korea to develop some of these other markets? I think those to me are places where we very much can work with the Trump administration and not lose any ground, and we've started some of those conversations.
Thank you. Congressman, you are the longest serving Indian American in the Congress.
That just means I'm old.
You've been a strong advocate of US-India relations, and you are on the subcommittee on South and Central Asia. How do you see Prime Minister Modi came in February. President Trump, I believe, is expected to go for the Quad Leaders Summit sometime this fall. How do you see the evolution of the US-India relationship, which has a strong bipartisan dimension? And if we look at the Indo-Pacific, broadly speaking, how does the two countries working together? Which areas would you focus on?
I mean, so the defense space is strong, right? The mill-to-mill relationship is strong. There's ups and downs. Certainly you saw some CATSA issues in the first Trump administration because of the reliance on a lot of legacy Russian defense tools. India's moving toward the West. India's moving towards the United States. I think that in the defense space, I think that will continue. India will always try to stay non-aligned, but I think at the end of the day, if you talk to the Indians, I think they recognize that their biggest threat and competitor is probably China. And we're trying to interpret what's happening on the northern lines of control. I don't see China really backing off and moving away from that. So I think that'll, maybe it's a little quieter right now, but I think that'll always be a point of contention. I was in India last summer visiting the Dalai Lama. the politics of succession there, like who's the next, are super interesting. It's really wonky, but trying to figure out, okay, what does that look like? Now, the Dalai Lama said he's going to live until 108. I'm not one to question that, but we would like him to name his successor before that. So I think, on the U.S.-India side, that's good. Pharmaceutical space, I think, is another area that we really very intentionally can build out. The vaccine space, certainly that's an area. And then one area that I've been talking about for a long time with the Indians is how we do aid and development in Africa. The Indian diaspora is much older, much deeper enmeshed in Africa. That's a place where we should partner together, right? So where it's in India's interest, it's in our interests. So, again, I think there's lots of natural areas of alignment.
Thank you. Before I turn to the audience, then if people have questions, please raise your hand and I'll come to you. Since you're also on the subcommittee on South and Central Asia, I'm going to throw in a question, which is, how do you see the US-India relationship vis-a-vis South Asia? Because of India has its own sort of, views of its neighbors, and there are long-term US relationships with each of the South Asian countries. How do you see that evolving in the next few months under this administration?
Yeah, so I think the US-India piece will grow stronger. What does that mean vis-a-vis Pakistan? Bangladesh is at a crossroads. How does Bangladesh's government evolve? What is the India-Bangladesh relationship, vis-a-vis the Hindu population in Bangladesh, and what happens there? Myanmar shares a border there. There hasn't been much discussion in the current administration about Myanmar, but you still have a real civil war taking place in Myanmar as well, and refugee crisis and challenges. Sri Lanka is emerging out of a challenging time. I'll throw the Maldives into South and South. That there's still a playing field there in terms of the influence and what happens there. So, I think we hurt ourselves in Nepal. With I went there 4 years ago when we were trying to get the Millennium Challenge Corporation grant across the finish line. That was not easy, but they extended political capital, got it done, and now, I think that's a black eye for us, and that sets us back in Nepal, which is a very fragile democracy. So, we could talk about Bhutan. I guess I'm not sure why it's on the travel ban list. I think as a tier 3 country, I don't think they're a threat to us.
Thank you. I'll turn to the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand and please wait for the mic to come to you. A gentleman up front.
Thank you very much. I'm Mike Fonte. I work for the Democratic Progressive Party here in Washington. So a question about Taiwan then. Seems to me Taiwan-India relationships has developed very well, but I'm wondering what your view of Taiwan's role within the larger Indo-Pacific. I think as a development partner, as a provider of other resources. Thanks very much for your past support for Taiwan, by the way.
Yeah, of course. Also co-chair of the Taiwan caucus. And we'll be leading a delegation to Taiwan, hopefully in the near future. Taiwan is a developed territory, developed economy, and I think it's critically important to us as the leading democracy in the world to continue to uphold the Taiwan Relations Act and the basic principle that it's up to the people of Taiwan to decide what their future is. It is good, to see the Indians and others, from an economic perspective, certainly growing their relationship. It's good to see Japan and the like. As I think about Taiwan per se, and again, I think we're trying to get a sense of how President Trump, I know where the Republican Party is with regards to Taiwan. I don't think anything's changed there. And folks within the cabinet, I'm not entirely sure how President Trump views Taiwan. And I know how Secretary Rubio views it. I know how Mike Waltz historically has viewed Taiwan. I don't use strategic ambiguity or strategic clarity. I use the term strategic deterrence because our goal really is to deter China from making a mistake that would be difficult on China, but certainly difficult on the rest of the world as well. And I think the goal here is deterrence, and I think that's where the Indians and others, so our goal is for Xi Jinping to wake up every day and say, today's not the right day. And I would tell, if folks in China are listening, today's not the right day.
Hello, my name is Sam. I'm an intern here at the Defense Technology Unit in Hudson. I'd like to ask you what you think the partnership between India and the U.S. might look like in terms of deterrence against China in the South China Sea and the 9-dash line.
Yeah, so India hasn't taken as much of a role in that maritime space, and I think that's where our partners like Japan, Australia, even some of the Europeans have stepped up in the South China Sea. I think our conversations with the Indians really are much more the Indian Ocean region, because again, we won't see the East Asian nations paying as much attention to the Indian Ocean region. And then this is more broad, like what keeps me awake at night is what we're seeing around the Philippines, right? And that's how wars get started, right? I mean, accidental, you've already seen a Filipino soldier die and the aggressiveness of how China's approached the South China Sea. President Marcos is, if there's a big incident where a number of Filipino sailors, perish or something happens, that'll force some sort of reaction. And I think that's the message, like, let's be careful here. We've also, when I was in Australia, we also did see some of the aggressiveness of the Chinese Navy around the waters between Australia and New Zealand, and certainly circumnavigating Australia. That's something we haven't seen before and something that we're paying very close attention to. So it doesn't totally answer the question. I don't see India taking a lead role, though, in the South China Sea. I think that'll be left to the East Asian nations and the U.S. Navy. And again, if we can get India to take a bigger role on the Indian Ocean region, my opinion, I think that's where we'd love to see that partnership happen.
Right up front, Tali.
Thank you. Congressman, how do you see do people know India well in the U.S., in the Washington, D.C. circles, in the Congress, and so on? Do you find that people are beginning to kind of get interested in India and say, look, this is of strategic importance? And if not, what can we do to enable it? Do you think we should be arranging more travels to India, more conversations? How do we get people to get to know the country better?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I think there's broad support in Congress, and you can see that. I'm no longer co-chair of the India caucus. Ro Khanna is the Democratic co-chair, but as a broad membership of that caucus, it's one of the largest caucuses in Congress, very bipartisan. So I think the interest is there in Congress. I think you're seeing the diaspora become much more politically engaged, and I think that's just a natural progression. My parents, were probably that first generation that immigrated in the late 1950s, but our children are, grown up, they're fully part of the diaspora in America, and you're seeing that piece of it. There's 6 members of Congress that are Indian American now, and there was only one a decade ago, or 13 when I first got elected. So I think you're seeing that representation. So I think that relationships, and not enough people have gone to India to understand the opportunities or the complexities. Still an overweight focus on China and East Asia, but you're seeing more people go. Obviously you see when Prime Minister Modi comes and strategically goes to San Francisco or Houston or New York, Chicago, you see the big rallies of the diaspora. And again, I think the broad American public, I've not looked at opinion polling, but probably has a relatively strong opinion of India. So I think those are all positives that are moving in the right direction. I think, again, you see some of the big Indian companies, Tata sponsoring the New York Marathon. I think it's the New York Marathon, and others. So you're, again, seeing those investments as well. So all positive. So, and then the number of members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans, who come up to me and say, we want you to lead a delegation to India, when can we go? Part of the reason why I don't travel to India as much is I actually think the relationship's in a good spot, so it's not troubled. So, and there are plenty of other troubled relationships right now, which demand our attention and travel, whereas I would not put India in one of those troubled relationships.
Thank you. Towards the back.
Thank you, Congressman. My name is Abhinav. I just finished working with Rich Verma at State 2 months ago, so it's great to see you, and thanks for all the insights so far. You mentioned the Dalai Lama a little while ago, and obviously this is his 90th birth year. In his, you mentioned succession as well. In his latest book, Voice for the Voiceless, he details that a successor will be named, but outside of China. And so
China's named their successor.
Yeah.
Maybe it will be in Palo Alto.
Fair. But I'd just be curious to hear your thoughts on, whether you see room to work with the Trump administration and even India to sort of adopt even, perhaps a more proactive stance on succession this year, given the 90th year. I know India has been wary of, making statements on Tibet as well, especially as they try to resume some dialogue with China on the borders right now. But I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are on whether you see room here in this space.
I mean, I don't think we can tell the Dalai Lama what to do. We can nudge along. I think all of us would love to, just from a geopolitical strategic perspective, that not a spiritual perspective, it would be great to have a Indian successor named, because I think that the politics would be really interesting at that point with vis-a-vis Tibet, but again, it's not. I'm not one of the successors. It is interesting though, like some of the potential successors that you talk about are these twins that, one of the twins in Palo Alto. So
Right at the back, the last row.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Bera. I'm Alan Cronstad with the Congressional Research Service. I noted that yesterday's full Senate Relations Committee had a hearing on Indo-Pacific threats, and I did a quick word count of the opening statements of the chairman and the ranking members. So combined 44 times for China, about 8 times for Japan, twice for Australia, and 0 for India. So again, a little frustration for India boosters. Aparna already kind of brought up the question of, for Washington, is India really part of the Indo-Pacific strategy? So I'll switch to another note that the worldwide threat assessment that just came out from ODNI makes no mention of the India-Pakistan conflict dyad. And that's the first time, I think, ever that I've been seeing this. So I wanted to get your thoughts on, has that dropped away as a major issue for the United States in terms of national security?
I mean, alternatively, maybe there's so many other fires going on right now that one is not the major fire, but is slightly less. I would say, I guess referring to what I, when I think about my strategic travel, and this is probably reflective about perhaps why India is not mentioned so much at this particular moment in time, is that things are relatively quiet, which might be a good thing, actually, right? So that, and whereas there have been times where India-Pakistan has consumed a lot of my time in dialogue, but that hasn't been at the forefront either. Now, that doesn't mean there's not tensions there, and it probably just means there's other places that are, really pulling our focus. So for me, the Pacific Islands are an area that I'm spending a lot of time thinking about, strategic deterrence around Taiwan. How do we make sure something doesn't happen? South China Sea, even ASEAN, in terms of, what's that influence look like, around some of those nations, AUKUS. And that's not to diminish the U.S.-India relationship. Again, spinning it as a positive, it may just be that the relationship is at a relatively good place. It is, Trump and Modi, I think, do have a genuine relationship. And, we'll see what happens around the tariff issue, and, does that cause conflicts? We'll also see, something that, I would hope, again, hopefully the Indians are listening to this. I think in the resolution of the Ukraine conflict, India really can play a big role here because of their relationship with. I would urge them to step up and take that role, because it's, certainly, hopefully, part of the Trump strategy here is, as that conflict reaches some conclusion, we also then start to move Russia away from China. I think the Europeans will start buying energy from Russia again fairly quickly. And the Indians can play a role in that, because it's in India's self-interest not to have a strong Russia-China relationship, but rather to move Russia away from China. Again, that's my opinion, but I think that many would share that opinion as well. So maybe not mentioning India much these days might be a good thing.
Last row it here. Gentleman with the black jacket. Aryan.
Thank you, Dr. Pandey. Congressman, I wanted to follow up on Dr. Pandey's last question to you about the greater South Asia region, especially smaller states like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, the Maldives. I mean, a lot of these countries are being heavily courted by the Chinese over the last few years. The chief advisor of Bangladesh is in China right now. Do you think the United States has done enough to convince these countries that they are the better partner for them in the Indian Ocean region? And how can we better that in the future? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think in the Biden administration, there was a recognition of the importance of these countries, these struggling democracies here. Obviously, I think the United States did pay attention to Sri Lanka as it went through its financial challenges and political changes. I don't know if I'm seeing the same level of attention at this current time within the administration. But from a congressional perspective and from the committee perspective, we were talking to Representative Kamala Gurdjieff, who's the ranking member on South Central Asia. We certainly did talk about each of these countries, and hopefully, from the congressional perspective, I think we talked about traveling to Bangladesh. It matters if we show up as well. And I think it is really important for members of Congress and others, particularly in Bangladesh, because again, this is it's coming out of some political turmoil. Which direction does it go? What happens next? I think it's important for us to be involved in that. Same in Sri Lanka, same in the Maldives. All three very important, and all three places that I would like to get to, and that we do spend a lot of time thinking about and talking about. But again, it matters for us to show up. And I know how the Biden administration thought about it, because we talked about those three countries a lot with Secretary Liu and others. I don't have as close a grasp with the Trump administration.
Shashwat in the last row. Grisham.
Hi, I'm Shashwat from CSIS. My question is in terms of Quad. India has always maintained that Quad is not a security alliance, but this time after the joint press release which happened, it talks about Quad in the context of security alliance. So is there a change in positioning? How do you view this? But India has always maintained that it is not.
Sure. I mean, India is going to maintain multiple positions at the same time. They're very good at that. I think they recognize that this is certainly a maritime security arrangement. There's a strong maritime security component. It's an economic arrangement as well. Let's not call it it's not a formal alliance per se, but it is a partnership. And there's a security component to that partnership from the maritime space. And maybe it's more comfortable for Indians to couch it as freedom of navigation, but freedom of navigation implies a security element as well.
The lady in the last row.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Malika. I'm from the State Department India desk. My question is, we often assume that India wants to work with us and that we're their first choice, but that's not always the case. So what, in your perspective, we're doing brainstorming on our end too, but what, in your perspective, do you think we can do to better incentivize India to choose us first across a broad range of different sectors?
So I wouldn't get into a tariff war. My opinion, I just don't think that would be productive at this moment in time. Yeah, certainly co-production where that makes sense. The pharmaceutical space, we talked about how on aid and development, I really do think a partnership going into Africa makes a lot of sense. In the vaccination space, I think India certainly can play a leading role. We have had conversations about how to harness the power of the Indian diaspora in the United States. It's the wealthiest diaspora, the most educated diaspora, but it is a very diverse group of folks. So how can you harness the power of the diaspora to also bring the two countries closer together? I still think I think India recognizes the opportunities here. So I think it's a pretty positive trajectory still. I mean, under Trump 1.0, the first administration, they talked about doing a trade deal with, I mean, that just seemed, any trade deals seemed like they were distant past, but maybe that is something as well, the contours of some kind of trading relationship. If there will be dialogue around tariffs because you hear President Trump often talk about how high India's tariffs are. And in that context, is there an opportunity to get a trade deal done or get something that's akin to a trading relationship? I'm positive on it, so I think there's plenty of places that we could work together.
You touched on this previously, but I wanted to ask you, in your opinion, why do you think that India should approach Russia and help what do you think? Why do you think their relationship should change in regards to Russia?
Why should their relationship change with regards to Russia? Or what role could? So again, India occupies this place where they want to sit at the big boy table, but at times they want to move off that table and be the champion of the developing world. I think India is not a developing nation. I think it's time for India to take its role at the table with the major countries around the world. But with that comes responsibilities as well. And that means you've got to take the good with the bad. You've got to be able to take the criticism that comes with being at the head table. I mean, it makes perfect sense to me. And we've had legislation in the past of making India a permanent member of the UN Security Council. That logically makes sense. But that comes with responsibility. So a first step to show that you're ready to sit at the head table could be, what is your role in helping find a resolution to the war in Ukraine? I really do. They've said that, right? When we've been upset about how much Russian oil they've been buying, right? It's like you're undermining the sanctions regime, you're providing a lot of cash. It's like, well, you want us to do this because we're maintaining lines of communication with Russia, and when this comes to an end. So it's like, okay, you've been telling us that for a long time. Now's the time to step up and do that. And I think that we'll see, because the Indians are probably listening. This is a good time to demonstrate that diplomacy, because again, I would not necessarily approach the resolution of the Ukraine conflict the way President Trump is approaching it. The Ukrainian people are the heroes here. Vladimir Putin's the aggressor, but he does want to bring this to an end, and I think that's reasonable and what that looks like. But the Indians can play a role in that. And it's not that the conflict will end, it's the what next. And we've been spending a lot of time thinking about what happens on the day after you find a ceasefire in Ukraine, because that's the real crux here. Where does Russia go? Yeah, I think the Russian-North Korea relationship is a transactional one. That's not deep, but what is the Russia-China relationship? And does Russia start moving back towards Europe, towards the West? I think there, that certainly could happen. And what is India's role in moving Russia? So, like, I'm not bored. It's interesting. These are all really, interesting things. But again, the reason why I think India can play a bigger role is this is their opportunity.
Gentleman in the last row.
The United States Commission on International Religious Freedom recently issued a scathing report about the alleged plot to assassinate the pro-Khalistan activist, I would say. Some in India call him an extremist. And India rejected that. And the report also called on New Delhi to, and basically criticize Modi's handling of the Muslim minorities in India. So how do you see these two issues playing out during Trump's first term? And how would that impact U.S. relations?
I don't think these will be priority areas in the Trump administration as they were under the Biden administration. We had multiple private conversations with the Indians about all of this. Extrajudicial killings of American citizens is not acceptable. And many of us had direct conversations with the Indians. That said, I don't think I don't think human rights or these issues will be as much a priority in the current administration. I don't think they were in his first term either.
Right at the back, Rai.
Representative Bera, thank you for being here with us today. I'm Rai. I'm an intern under Dr. Pandey, actually. My question is that, every time Prime Minister Modi and Mr. President Trump, they meet, there are a lot of acronyms we see, a lot of passion projects, a lot of talk, but we don't really see a lot of action being taken, It's all lost in the bureaucratic noise within both sides. And, there's also an issue where both, especially India, is hesitant towards operational collaboration when it comes to defense, when it comes to military partnership between the two countries. And you can extend the same premise to, market entry issues with India, licensing issues, IP issues, those kind of things, So my question is, why is this time different under Trump 2.0, and how can, India and the US really extend legitimate partnership, actionable progress, and really not, go beyond those promises and convert into, bilateral partnership that's actually seen?
Yeah, so that's a hard question in the sense that Trump 2.0 has taken trade, tariffs in a direction that we've never seen. So, I don't know what 25% tariffs on autos mean. Again, as I'm headed off to Korea, I think those conversations are going to be very different today than they would have been a week ago. So I would start by, let's not get in a trade war with our closest friends, and then with the potential really close friends like India. I would say go back to your first administration where you actually were trying to get a trade deal. I don't see that happening at this juncture. So then, on the Indian side, are there things they can do internally to make procurement and reduce their bureaucracy, which often is a frustration for U.S. companies? Because and this sounds funny because the United States has now been the unpredictable partner where we were always predictable, whereas I used to always say, the challenge with India is if I'm a big multinational company thinking about multi-billion-dollar investment in India, I want to know what the rules are. And the problem with India is I might make an assumption on this set of rules, and then somebody changes it, and they're over here. Whereas with China, I know what the rules are. I may not like the rules, but I can then factor that into my investment because there's a predictability. India is not predictable. The Indians would say to us, you have export controls and things like that that just don't make any sense and make it difficult on their end. So I think it's much better today than it was when I first got to Congress in 2013. And that's just subjective because a number of companies that used to come into my office and say, hey, can you talk to the Indians about IP protections or this issue or that issue? Those issues are still there, but I think they're better. I hesitate, again, I would hope, if this was just an extension of Trump 1.0, I would have said, we're going to work on a trade deal, et cetera. But I don't know because I think we've become much less predictable.
Any final question? You get the last question. Let's wait for the mic.
Hi, thank you so much for coming today. You mentioned BRI, and I think China obviously has the tentacles in Sri Lanka as well as the Southeast Asian countries and Africa. Is there a place where you see American-Indian cooperation countering BRI?
Yeah, I mean, Sri Lanka is a really interesting example because you have the Hambantota port and then you have a port in Colombo as well, GFC working with others. And it is a real great contrast in the different approaches to development and financing. And here's how we do it, here's how they do it. And we should be talking about that a lot more, and certainly not talking to an American audience, talking to an Asian audience. I think there's more that we can do, right? I mean, we have to reauthorize the Development Finance Corporation. I think we should increase their lending limits. I think we should give them a little bit more flexibility, but don't get rid of it. I mean, it is something that was bipartisan in Trump's first administration. The president talks about a sovereign wealth fund. We don't know exactly what he means by that. Don't turn the DFC into a sovereign wealth fund. We think that would be a bad idea. But perhaps having a sovereign wealth fund, that gives you another tool. And then third, how do we partner with Japan, Korea, other countries, the Europeans, where we're not in competition, but where we want to go into to Africa nations and others, and help develop those economies for our benefit, but also for the benefit of those countries. So the Mineral Security Partnership is a great example of how we can partner with other countries to go create redundant supply chains. So step number one, do no harm. So don't get rid of the Development Finance Corporation. Step number two, let's enhance the DFC. Step number three, maybe there's a role for a sovereign wealth fund. So,
thank you. Thank you, Congressman Bera, for coming over today, and thank you for everyone for this conversation. Thank you.
Great, thank you.